Good morning, and welcome to the First Parish Church of Stowe and Acton. Here comes Anne, who is going to give our welcome and announcements. Good morning again. We would like to acknowledge that this service is being held by a community that gathers on the stolen lands of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, Pawtucket, and Wampanoag people. We pay respect to those Indigenous peoples who lost their lives in the colonization of this land, and recognize that these Indigenous tribes are still today facing violations of sovereignty, territory, and water. We also give thanks for the earth we walk upon, the waters, the life-giving plants, and all the earth's creatures, as well as the winds, sun, moon, and stars. We recognize that this is just a first step in moving toward right relationship with Native peoples and healing of the earth. Good morning again. Welcome to First Parish Church of Stowe and Acton, FPC, as it's known to our members and friends, a welcoming and spiritual community. My name is Anne Sadler, and I serve as a lay minister. If this is your first time with us, we welcome you. Please let us know you are here by filling out one of our visitor information cards in the pews and hand it to an usher, drop it in the plate, or hand it to Meg, our welcoming staff member. She's at the back, raising her hand. We won't add you to any of our email lists unless you check that box to do so. Our minister and staff are listed on the front of the order of service. Please feel free to ask me or any of these people for more information about the church and its programs after the service, or by email or through the chat if you're online. We also invite you to check out our webpage for news and information, and you can sign up there for our newsletter and email alerts. We ask that people remain masked in our sanctuary, except in the balcony and in church offices and RE spaces, but the rest of our building is mask optional. Please check with people you're talking to about their comfort level, and please make sure the air filters are on when you congregate in any room. If you'd like a large print order of service or hymnal, or an assisted listening device, please ask one of the ushers. Our assisted listening devices are actually small radios that work throughout the building if you would like to listen to the service from another space for any reason. After the service, please join us for coffee and conversation in our fellowship hall, which is one level down at the other end of our building, over that way, or in a breakout room if you're joining us online. I'd like to draw your attention to the announcements in our order of service, as well as information about how to sign up for our email lists and newsletter. But I would particularly like to point out that after the service today at 11:20, there will be a meeting in the community room, a cottage meeting to discuss the future of RE, future plans for RE. So please consider attending that meeting, and there will be childcare. And now it's time to look around you and say hi to the folks around. Greet your neighbour.
We're inviting you again to join us in our Introit this morning. Our Introit, you'll hear us singing several different things, but in the middle of it, you'll hear us sing, love, love, love. All we need is love, love, love. All we need is love, love. And we're going to ask you to join that. Can you try it with me? Love, love, love. All we need is love, love, love. All we need is love, love, love. All we need is love, love, love. Good. So when we hear that, when you hear the choir singing that part, come in and join us. Love is, love is, love is love. Love is, love is, love is love. Oh, love is, love is, love is love. Oh, love is, love is, love is love. Oh, love, love, love. All we need is love, love, love. All we need is love, is love, is love, is love. Love is love, is love, is love. Oh, love is love, is love, is love. Love is love, is love, is love. Oh, love is love, is love, is all we need is love, is love, is love, is all we need is love, is love, is love, is all we need is love, 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 is all we need is love,
Good morning again. Our opening words are by Monica Jacobsen, The Heart of Our Faith. What is it that calls you here, that calls you onward, that calls you inward, that leads you homeward? What is it that gives you the power to make that change, to ask that question, to take that journey? What is it that says you have done well, that asks you to learn more, that brings you to stillness, that holds you up in hard times? It is relationship, the beating heart of our faith. It begins when we share this hour, our truths, this air, our hearts. Come, let us worship together. Our chalice is the symbol of Unitarian Universalism, created after the flaming chalice was used as a symbol to mark safety during World War II and embraced by the Unitarian Universalist Association after merger. I'm going to light our chalice this morning as we sing "Where is Our Holy Church?", a song of questions and responses about what is church. Number 113, please rise in body or in spirit. And please join in our covenant and affirmation printed in your orders of service. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Okay, I know you were given a handout along with the order of service that has the principles in it. Don't look at them. Don't look at the beginnings of your hymnals where they're also printed. Don't run down the hall and look at the wall. And I want to ask all of you, but including especially our children, because I think one of the things we first start talking about what is Unitarian Universalism and religious education is through our principles. So tell me you don't have to name the principles, but what about the principles is most important to you? And raise your hand, I'll kind of point at you and you can just yell out and I will repeat what I hear or summarize it into the microphone. So what about the principles is most important or meaningful to you? Kids or adults? The free search for truth. Hector. Inherent worth and dignity of every person. I see a hand back here? No? Okay. The interconnected web. The idea of respect. Anyone up in the balcony? No? Okay.
Justice and democracy.
Justice and democracy. Welcomeness to everyone.
Their brevity.
Their what? Their brevity. Yes. Taking care of our climate. Now, I asked this question online as well, and here are some of the responses you gave. There's a whole lot of words up there. And as I analyzed them, I found that all of the 7 principles were reflected, particularly the 7th, which is respect for the interdependent web. You had the words respect, interdependent web, interdependence, interconnectedness, interconnected web, et cetera, and then some words that were kind of related to that of earth-centered nature, environment, and green. The second most reflected principle was our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And that came up with the words worth and dignity and worth and dignity of every person, etc. But all of our principles were represented. The word community was one of the biggest words that meant the most people shared it. And that word is in our 6th principle, saying a world community of peace and justice and liberty for all. But I think that when we said community, we also meant something bigger or smaller than world community. We meant different kinds of communities are important to us in the principle. And all the 2nd, 5th, 3rd, and 4th principles were represented as well in your responses. And then there were a lot of words that aren't in our principles that you added that are about the impression of the principles. And those were shared values, inclusion, love. Love is not in the principles. Guidelines for life, variety, trust, openness, caring and generous, and truth and beliefs and unity, and your voice being heard, reassuring of your values, etc. And also in your responses were some little things about your feelings about changing the principles. It said, okay as they are, and do not mess with them. So we're going to be talking more about that in the sermon today, because there is a proposal to mess with them, to change the principles, and that's up for vote. And we, as the people of Unitarian Universalism, vote on that, and we're going to talk more about that process and what's being proposed during the sermon. And now I'm going to invite our children and youth to go off to religious education. Rebecca Stodolik is our DRE of the day, as Marissa's having one of her days off, and Tommy is supposed to take our lantern down. So come on forward, Tommy. Let us hold all of these joys and sorrows expressed in our hearts and minds, and also send our energy and thoughts and prayers out to those that are left unspoken. Please join me in a moment of silence. Blessed be. Amen. This month we share our plate with the Stowe and Acton Area Interfaith Partnership to support Afghan refugees that our Support Asylum Seekers Task Force has been very engaged with. So your money today goes not only to support the good work of this church in keeping lights on and staff paid, but also to support asylum seekers in our area, that they too are able to have lights on and food on the table. So please give generously and enjoy this piece from our choir.
Be still and feel the calm beside me. May I be still and let the Spirit guide me. May I be still and hear the voice of God descending from and filling me until I am still. May I be silent and hear the world around me. May I be silent and let the light surround me. May I be silent and listen to my heart, especially the part that speaks of peace to me. Silently.
Thank you, choir. Thank you, Brad. Our reading today comes from the Universalist tradition, from a book from 1922 by Lewis Fisher, a reverend, titled Which Way? Universalists are often asked to tell where they stand. The only true answer to give to this question is that we do not stand at all. We move. Or we are asked to state our position. Again, we can only answer that we are on the march. We do not stand still, nor do we defend any immovable positions, theologically speaking. We grow and we march, as all living things forever must do. The main questions with universalists are not where we stand, but which way are we moving? Not which positions we defend, but which way are we marching? Thus ends the reading. Our next hymn is number 145, as Tranquil Streams. And this song was written pre-merger, but it is a merger song about the merger of Unitarianism and Universalism. You'll see that the words were written by Marion Franklin Ham, who died before the merger, but the youth movements were already merging and embraced this song first. Please stand in body or in spirit and join in singing. So, in 1961, Unitarianism and Universalism merged, forming a new religious association. That association would be an association of congregations, although a few lifetime members of one of the joining associations were grandfathered in as individual members. It would be democratic, with congregations sending delegates to vote on the association's business. And it would be non-creedal, with principles embedded into the bylaws, but addressed to congregations to uphold them, not individuals. In 1961, the principles the UUA voted in sound dated now to our ears. They include phrases like the dignity of man, brotherhood, justice, and peace, and men of goodwill in every land. They include a reference to God. And over time, as I said, they began to sound dated. The rise of feminism in Unitarian Universalism in the 1970s and into the 1980s was the primary reason why in 1985 and 1986 we changed the principles. It takes a 2-year vote to change any certain bylaws, like the principles in Article 2 in the UUA. So in 1986, we changed our principles to the ones you know now and are printed on our wall by the elevator on slates from our old roof. And in the front of your hymnals, although some of our hymnals are old enough that they need some changes and updates to things that were voted to change. And we added new sections to Article 2 as well. Some of the old principles concepts were moved to new areas like non-discrimination, purposes, and freedom of belief. So a whole new section of Article 2 is called Principles and Purposes. And we moved statements about Judeo-Christian heritage and God to a new section within the principles, but below them, called informally the sources. And we added a bunch more of religions and non-religious sources to the sources of our authority as Unitarian Universalists for us to say that we draw from all of these in our faith. If you compare the 1961 and 1986 principles, you'll see, let's see where that slide is. Sorry, I put it out of order somehow. Nope. Did I pass it? Yes. That's the problem. Well, I'll find it. Anyway, if you compare them, the 1961 and 1986, you'll see that most of the grand ideas of 1961 still exist somewhere in Article 2, although some parts of them were moved to other areas of Article 2, and all of them were dramatically reworded. The UUA bylaws have within them the idea that the principles of all of Article 2 are supposed to be examined and reviewed every 15 years. But we've been irregular about following those bylaws as an association. Just as sometimes congregations are a little bit slack about following all of their rules, if you look into all the details. But a number of times changes to Article 2 have been proposed over the years. Here's this comparison of 1961 and 1985 to 86. And you can see just my color coding. Most things appear but are dramatically reworded. So in 1985, we added something that's become very, very important to a lot of Unitarian Universalists. It was controversial and quite the debate at General Assembly. And now, almost 20 years later, it perhaps wouldn't seem so, although to some, maybe it would. We added earth-centered traditions to the spiritual sources we draw from, embracing paganism and Native American traditions as part of the religious traditions that we draw our inspiration from and embrace. And as a result, pagan groups, CUPS groups they're called, Covenant of UU Pagans, proliferated around churches across the US, and pagan celebrations got incorporated into our worship services across the UUA. And then in 2009, a whole host of changes were suggested and rejected. I know you can't read everything on the slides I'm showing, but the important thing is to see like the volume and the colors, basically. But all of the 2009 changes were rejected. But then in 2013, one of the things from 2009 was accepted, which is that we changed the non-discrimination section in Article 2 to be called inclusion. And we changed some of the words in it. And then in 2017, one of the most recent votes occurred when we rejected one proposal and passed another. We rejected a proposal to change the inherent worth and dignity of all people to the inherent worth and dignity of all beings. Why do you think we rejected that? I think it was fear that if we changed that, we would all have to become vegetarians. And as an association, we weren't ready for that pressure. Too many people were afraid that they'd be going against our faith if they didn't become vegetarian if we changed inherent worth and dignity of all people to all beings. So we rejected that proposal. But we changed the prophetic words and deeds of men and women to prophetic deeds of people, getting rid of the binary gendered language there. And around the same time, we began to start talking about an 8th principle, about anti-racism, to be added to the 7 that we have. This was a big enough change being talked about, and we were overdue for an Article 2 commission. So we decided to convene a commission, as we should have done many times before, to examine all the principles and give us a concrete suggestion for the whole of Article 2. So that Article 2 commission issued a proposal, a draft of their proposal back in November. That got some feedback. I gave it some feedback. And now they've come out with the version that will go to the General Assembly to be voted on, with amendments that we can propose through an amendment process that will be coming up. Like we did in the 1980s, it has a lot of resonances that repeat the past, but also is a holistic change, and so many things are new. And it'll go for a vote this June. And then if it passes, which it might, it will go for a vote the following year, and that vote will need a 2/3 majority. And between now and June, there'll be an amendment process, and then those amendments will also be voted on at General Assembly. The biggest and most controversial part of the proposed Article 2 revisions is that the principles and sources below the principles are suggested to be replaced with a section replacing the principles called values and covenant, and then a replacement of the sources into a new section, which weren't always their own section, which was always kind of confusing. And that section will be called inspirations. So let's take a quick look at the inspirations, and then we're going to dive into those values and covenant replacing the principles theoretically. This proposal for the inspirations takes out the whole list of sources that we say that we draw upon. And this is similar to what was proposed and rejected in 2009. And it replaces them with a more global statement. Originally, it said something about sacred understandings being what we are inspired by. And I was one of a number of people, I'm a little proud of this, who made the suggestion that they change sacred to sacred and secular. And they did. So now it says that we as Unitarian Universalists draw from the sacred and secular sources. And so that means that we include that we draw from science, and we draw from words and deeds of people right here on earth, and we draw from our own experiences that are both sacred and secular. Overall, I think this sources change to inspirations is probably a needed change. As we pointed out by adding that sixth source in 1990, a bulleted list is always by its nature incomplete. But we could also say that we lose something by not enumerating our sources. We have among us as a congregation Jewish UUs and Christian UUs and humanist and pagan and more. We have in our congregation on given weeks Muslims and Hindus and people who draw their inspiration from Buddhism and more. So this is a question. Is it problematic to make a list where maybe we're leaving some people out? Or is it more valuable that we have a list whereby some people feel specifically welcomed? I think it's always worth lifting up that our faith holds as authoritative not just scriptures, but also our own experiences. And that's a little bit missing. So there are arguably pluses and minuses to this change. Overall, I think it's probably something I'd vote for, because the pluses are bigger for me than the minuses. But I'm a bit mixed personally. Now, the big thing in the principles and the whole Article 2 revision is that the principles are being replaced by proposed values and covenant. And personally, I'm also a little bit mixed on this. And most of you probably will be also, although some of you will love it, and some of you really won't. So we'll want to have more conversation and discussions as a congregation, and that's part of the process. We can discuss, we can amend, and then we can vote. The values and covenant proposal is basically 7 parts, but they're different 7 than the 7 principles. Love is the big one and at the center. And then it's followed by 6 more: interdependence, pluralism, justice, transformation, generosity, and equity. I like that you can rattle them off in a short list like this. And I already have that list memorized, although sometimes I forget one. That's been true for the principles for my whole life, since 1986. Each value has a statement about the value, and then is followed by a covenant. Now, the principles were also a covenant. The beginning says that we, as congregations, covenant to affirm and promote them. This is a little different, in that the covenants are more robust and call on us to do more. And the very beginning is different, because it starts with these words: as Unitarian Universalists, we covenant, congregation to congregation, and through our association. Now remember, the principles say that we as congregations covenant, whereas this proposal is saying that we as Unitarian Universalists covenant. That's a big polity change to me, and probably the one amendment I'll be proposing. And because that's the kind of polity wonk I am. Or I'll want to hear from the Article 2 Commission why they've changed this from congregations to individuals. Going on, it says, we draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, these shared values are, and then it lists the 6. Now, pausing here, this is the part I love. Love, love, love. Because for me, the fact that love wasn't in our principles was a thing that I missed. I see this as a lifting up of our universalist heritage in a positive way. And I'm going to preach all about love next week. So you'll hear more about my thoughts about that. But I also like that these values not only address our principles and bring them in, which I'll show, but they bring in other foundational Unitarian Universalist documents as well as non-UU sources. One example is that I see here that the Unitarian Trinity, as it's sometimes called, of freedom, reason, and tolerance. You've heard that phrase before? Freedom, reason, and tolerance as part of UUism? No? Well, it used to be on advertising campaigns and stuff, and it comes from this old Earl Morse Wilbur history book about Unitarianism. And that's evoked in these values. And also, I see evoked in it James Luther Adams's 5 smooth stones. I've talked about the 5 smooth stones before, and I use them in our new member ceremonies. And it brings in hope, in particular in this first part. And hope wasn't there in the principles. And I like that too. Like I said, there are parts about these values that I don't like. They're a lot wordier. They change the beginning in ways I don't like. There are things that are missing. But these are things that I find value in being added. So let's look at these 7 values. They are designed to not be in any particular order. So I'm shuffling them from the order that's in the proposed document. Equity. Equity is the value that says we declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. You can see that right there, our first principle is embedded in that value. And then it goes on to have a covenant that follows. Here's the first principle's worth, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Generosity is something of a new value. This is something that's not so much in the principles, although it does bring in the word of compassion from the second principle. It says, we cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. But I see this as pulling in something else from outside of our faith as well. It, along with the next value I'm going to list on interdependence, brings in Martin Luther King's words for me. When we say here that our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality, it echoes so clearly for me the Martin Luther King words when he says, in a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Interdependence says real clearly, we honor the interdependent web of all existence. And so that is clearly bringing in our 7th principle, which is so important and so meaningful to many of us that it showed up biggest in our word cloud. And maybe our climate change task force might love that this pushes us to go a little further in its covenanting language. It calls on us to cherish Earth and all beings by creating nurturing relationships of care and respect. And we acknowledge the great web of life and do work to repair harm in its damaged relationships. Justice. Justice here really brings in the language from the proposed 8th principle, saying we work to be diverse, multicultural communities where all thrive. But justice is also where so many other principles and other things come in this values statement. One of them that I see is that James Luther Adams's 5 smooth stones is coming in again because he has a smooth stone that is about the covenant part of justice, that we are actively working on justice. And justice is the one word that's mentioned twice right now in our UU principles. It's in both the 2nd and the 6th. And so this is bringing in both of those. it also brings in the democratic process in the justice section. In the covenant, it says with the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions is part of our covenant. And the other half, and that's from our fifth principle. The other half of our fifth principle is the right of conscience. And just like the 1961 principles took some of the principles and moved them into other sections of Article 2, this proposal takes the other part of Principle 5, the right of conscience, and moves it down into the freedom of belief section. So we'll see that later. Transformation. Transformation is saying we adapt to the changing world. This isn't so much a concept that's in our principles right now, but it's really a major nod to James Luther Adams's 5 Smooth Stones, where he talks about the fact that revelation is continuous, that we believe that things and our knowledge and our truth is always changing. And of course, it echoes back to Louis Fisher's words that universalists are often asked to tell where they stand, and the true answer is that we don't stand, we move. But I also see transformation as bringing in a little bit of our third principle in that spiritual component. And that third principle's acceptance of one another is also in the next value of pluralism, which says we celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. In its covenant, it brings in the entirety of our fourth principle, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Now, those are the values that are proposed. And I wanted to show here that like some of the principles, like the second principle, are kind of split among several. Our second principle is justice, equity, and compassion, and justice goes into one value, and equity into another, and compassion into a third. Those are the values proposed, and they do cover all the principles, although some are divided, like that one. When one looks back at the whole list of UU principles and highlights the words that appear in the values, we can see that most is retained and very little is lost. Here's another way of looking at it. But one thing I can see in here that is lost, that might affect this church the most, and that we might want to propose a change for, Neil, is that the word peace is not there, right? We are a church that has had a weekly peace vigil for how many years? 20 plus years. And peace isn't there. So maybe that's where we throw in an amendment. Maybe we want to propose a way that peace gets included. Maybe they did it this way also for a reason, because we're still working so hard on justice, and justice is so emphasized here. And as they say, no justice, no peace. So why are these changes being proposed? What's the meaning behind all of it? Well, think back first to those 1985 to 86 principles that we have now today. Why were they so dramatically different? Feminism. The answer was feminism. The equality of women. In the 1961 was very gendered language. And our language was shifting and changing in how we responded, how we spoke. And growing ecology also meant bringing in respect for the interdependent web, which was a whole new principle, as well as the importance of earth-based religions, which came in a little bit later. Today, the answer is somewhat similar. UUA President Susan Frederick Gray explains this. In the mid-2010s, the ground began to shift again, much as it did in response to the women's movement. The emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, the election of Donald Trump with his racist and misogynistic campaign, and the urgent calls to confront white supremacy culture in our own movement. All of these compelled UUs to ask questions about whether our principles fully reflected fully who we are and who we need to be. End quote. When I really stopped and listened to that, to the idea that it's within our efforts to become more justice and equity focused, a more justice and equity focused faith that sets these values to emerge, it starts to make sense. The values pull out a lot of concepts, but justice, equity, and pluralism together strike a strong note. And that's intentional. It's a statement about where we need to be as an association. When I hear that bell chime and when these three come together in my mind, I understand it all a bit differently. And personally, I might not be ready to let go of the principles the way they are. They've been there ever since I was in high school. But I also hear the call from voices outside mine about what they need to hear in Article 2. And I'm opening my heart and listening, witnessing, holding that truth as I wrestle with my own. Now, compared to the questions that arise in the values and covenant and inspiration sections, the changes to the other sections are much smaller and less controversial. The purposes section is moved to the beginning, which frankly I think makes sense. This is an article that goes in our UUA bylaws, so putting it right up front what our purposes are makes sense. But when you look at each one of them, that bell that I was hearing playing is louder. So in the purposes, much of what was there is still there, but it adds that our faith's purpose is to heal historic injustices. And it adds that our purposes are to actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. Those are newly added to our purposes. And then to our inclusion, the section is almost the same, but it adds two phrases. One of which is to say that when we are working for inclusion, it is especially for those with historically marginalized identities. And the freedom of belief section is almost exactly the same, though, showing that we do still, ultimately, at the end of all of this, have our freedom of belief to believe what we will, no matter what the principles or values say. When I think back on what is important in the principles to me, and what is important in Article 2 to me, most of what I would have said I love is still there, with a couple small exceptions. Peace being one. The belief that we draw from our own individual experiences of wonder is another. And there's not much in here that I disagree with, particularly if we change it from what we as Unitarian Universalist covenant to this, to we the congregation's covenant to this. Then there's space in Unitarian Universalism for all of our disagreement. And it's still right there in the end that this is not a creedal test. You can have your disagreement, and yet this can still hold us together. So look back at what you said was most important. Was it respect? Was it community? Was it inclusion, worth and dignity, interdependent web, welcoming, equity, values? And maybe there's a little more than there was before. Values, pluralism, generosity, love. And you can open your hearts, at least I can a little, to the possibility that what you need is still there. But this is something more for someone else who needs more too. That's how I'm trying to reframe my perspective, and I invite you to as well. What I love about the principles most is that they're in the bylaws. That's kind of silly, isn't it? That they're in the bylaws. And the fact that they're in the bylaws means that therefore they are something we have agreed on and something we can change when we're ready to. And maybe this is that moment, and maybe it's not. But our democratic faith, our non-creedal nature, that carries through whatever the outcome. May it be so. Our closing hymn is number 1028, The Fire of Commitment. Please rise in body and spirit.
Yeah.
Thank you, drums, John. Our words of benediction are Let the Center Hold by Joe Cherry. This is my prayer. Please let the center hold. The center is what holds our faith together. The strength of the center is what allows us to stretch further into the future, to the unknown, the untried, the uncertain, the unnerving, places where growth happens. Let the center be strong. And let the center of this living tradition move with the times. Let the center of our living tradition lead the times. May the strength of the center strengthen us as we seek, as we embody compassion, work for equity, demand justice for all. Let our center hold, strong as an old oak tree, flexible as the willow tree, life-giving as the orange tree, evergreen as the pine tree, and as beautiful as the almond tree in blossom. Amen.